Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I walk through the current version of my Sunday sermon. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked, for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them. Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the gospel going out through Paul. And if you read Paul's presentation of the gospel in Acts 13, and in many of his other sermons, you see it usually had three components. Jesus is risen. Jesus is Israel's Messiah, the fulfillment of Israel's story, and Jesus is Lord. And of course, in the context of the Roman Empire, those were pretty dramatic words. Now, last week we saw in Philippi, the focus was on a demonstration of miraculous power. The deliverance of a slave girl from a python spirit of Delphi provoked a riot. There was an earthquake, and in the aftermath, the Roman jailer thought he should kill himself. But through Paul, he saw God's mercy and Jesus' lordship over the world, leading to the baptism of his household. Now, he went to Thessalonica. Things didn't go so well, and so we'll pick up the story in Acts chapter 17. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the Scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. As a result, many of them believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. But when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God in Berea, some of them went there too, agitating the crowds and stirring them up. The believers immediately sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed in Berea. Those who escorted Paul brought him to Athens, and then left with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Now, I find this very interesting because, of course, Paul of Tarsus grew up in the larger Greco-Roman world, which means that Athens must have indeed been a rather phenomenal place full of idols, temples, altars, all sorts of religious things. And what's interesting is sort of the convergence of what would be philosophy, the love of wisdom, and also popular, what we would call religion, although, as we'll talk about, they didn't really see it that way. And we're going to have to explore that a little bit when we look at Athens. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks. Again, that was his practice, and he probably continued to make the point, Jesus is risen, Jesus is Israel's Messiah, the fulfillment of her story, and Jesus is Lord, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate him. And we see here that Athens is both popular with philosophers and, a popular religious destination. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. There again, you can see these main points that he repeats again and again. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul then stood up at the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious." Now we have to pause there, because part of the difficulty here is that there's really no set word for religion the way we think about it in the Bible. Religion, as we tend to understand it in our own minds, is really a product of modern secularism, where you can be religious or not religious. there's a very interesting video by Tom Holland where he asks, was there religion in the ancient world? We look back and say, oh my, all of those idols and altars and temples, that's all religion, as opposed to what military and farming and commerce, etc., etc. Those are our categories. And so if you delve a little deeper into the language in Greek behind what contemporary translators translate as religious, it's this very interesting word, it's a very long Greek word, Daimonestheros. There we go. There's the whole thing. I should have practiced that. I think that in today's language, I think actually spiritual would have been better. I think that's probably a closer approximation. But again, when you have spiritual, but you have altars and temples and idols and statues, people say, oh, that's religion. But in terms of trying to understand how it worked in their world, well, we're going to talk quite a bit about that. Paul is talking about their relationship with the daimon. Now, those of you who know some Plato and have some familiarity with that word, much later the word would have been sort of connected with demon, but that's when we think about demons. That's not really what they're talking about with that word. A daimon is something between spirit and God or gods. You can see this from Plato's Symposium. These are sort of intermediaries. An important spirit, Socrates. All spirits occupy the middle ground between humans and gods. And what's their function, I asked. They translate and carry messages from men to gods and from gods to men. They convey men's prayers and the gods' instructions and men's offerings and the gods' return on these offerings. As mediators between the two, they fill the remaining space and so make the universe an interconnected whole. They enable divination to take place and priests to perform sacrifices and rituals, cast spells, and do all kinds of prophecy and sorcery. Divination and humanity cannot meet directly. The gods only ever communicate and converse with men in their sleep or when conscious by means of spirits, and these are these daimons. And again, even the translator, well, if you either leave the Greek word there or you translate it here. Skill in this area is what makes a person spiritual, whereas skill in other art or craft ties a person to the material world. There are many great different kinds of spirits then, and one of them is love. In Plato's Symposium, they're having discussions about love. Daimons are really anything that can take over a man. It's sort of a spiritual, or a woman. It's sort of a spiritual power, and that's why I think spiritual is probably a better translation. Athens was beyond many in studying the world, and that's sort of where the philosophy and this popular spirituality comes from. On one hand, they have this philosophy, and on the other hand, this daimonism, let's call it. And now, one of the things, if you go to the 9:30 adult Sunday school class, I keep reinforcing is sort of these two different takes on the world. The common assumption in the ancient world that there was sort of an impersonal meta-divine realm in which the gods, often sort of like big people or stars or animals, think about the zodiac, they're up there in the sky, and these daimons, as we see, sort of are go-betweens. And Cupid would be like that because love would overtake you. Let's say the spirit of love, or all these different spirits might overtake you. And I don't mean something different from how we experience things. You can get enthusiasm. You can have all these things where you watch a movie and sort of its spirit carries you away, and people down below. Whereas this radical biblical monotheism, that's the religion of the Bible, God is sort of the arena, because there's nothing above God. With the meta-divine realm, they had like fates, and they'd often try to sort of capture this in terms of rules of the cosmos, but God in the Hebrew world is the arena, and the sun, moon, and stars obey God. But God is also a character in the story. It's God the Father, the Lord of the Old Testament, God the Son, Jesus, and God the Holy Spirit. So So God is both an agent within the arena and the arena itself. And you might even think about Jacob's ladder, where you have these angels going back and forth on this ladder, messengers from heaven, let's say. Now, in Athens, you have this intellectual veneer on a consumer spirituality because, well, there's sort of a duality here that looks kind of counterintuitive. They're meeting on Mars Hill or Ares Hill, basically. Ares is the god of war. It's a god that can fill the army with the power to overcome their enemies. But there's also a world of idea that's not really distinct from these others, and you can see Plato wrestling with these kinds of ideas in his work. Ideas play similar to appetites and desires. A new idea is as much of a thrill as a new pleasure for many people, or a new thirst. And the Greeks feel sometimes above it all, but the philosophers share the same space as the spiritual consumers. And so what Athens does with all of its temples and all of its idols and all of its altars is they're trying to manage all of the appetites and spirits and powers that overcome people, that we enjoy, that we try to resist. All of that Athens tries to have a grip on from top to bottom. As I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, Paul says, I even found an altar with this inscription to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. Now, a number of centuries later, Jerome had a little bit of a thought that Paul took some homiletical liberty with respect to this, because apparently this was not an uncommon thing in Greek cities to have altars to the unknown gods. Now, these daimons could be beneficial, and you might broker an arrangement with them by offering a sacrifice or going to the temple or something like that in order to sort of make exchanges. But you were also subject to their whims, and so they were very dangerous. And that's a big part of sort of having all of these altars, to keep all of the gods and to keep everything straight and yourself protected. And so you would simply multiply the number of altars and the number of temples to make sure you had all your bases covered. But just in case there were other ones that you didn't know that might come and wreak havoc and cause chaos in your city, well, here you have one that's sort of doing it for everything. It's in some ways similar to, let's say, you have the tomb of the unknown soldier, and you realize that there are soldiers who die, and you get lost in the bookkeeping, so you have one sort of catch-all. And this is to keep their bases covered, because what if you fall prey to a daimon? It might take you over, and it might ruin your life. So here's an altar that you can sort of catch all of them with. Now, Paul's going to use this as an opening. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. In many of these cases, people wanted things from gods, and gods needed things from people. And so it's always the exchange. And that is exactly what people would do with the altars and the temples and all of the idols. This vision of the God of the Hebrews is much more generous. Rather, he himself gives life, gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that he should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. And you can see this, the God of the Hebrews is a very different thing from all of the little gods of the Greeks. In fact, sometimes people will say, well, the Lord is sort of like Zeus, but even Zeus, you had Zeus of Olympus, and you had Athena of Athens. And in fact, even these gods, they weren't at all sort of like these global gods that we have. They were these eruptions of spiritual power that would sort of take people over, or that you would call upon. That was the nature of what today we would call religion in the Greek world. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, although he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Now, what Paul is laying down here is God's mission to the world through Israel. And he's connecting with their poets, who are sort of their philosophers. They didn't have a Bible from which they found revelation. They sort of read the poets and would try to gain wisdom and try and understand the basic workings of the world as they knew it. But God's election of Israel wasn't just for Israel, but it was rather for the world. That comes clear when God's promise to Abraham is that through the world Abraham would be blessed. And so he quotes these Stoic prophets as sort of a bridge. Now, I talk about this in one of my Sunday school classes that you can look up online. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by design and skill. Paul's offense at all of the idolatry in Athens is because Paul understands something about Israel's God, that unlike Zeus of Olympus or Athena of Athens and all of these beings that could be conceptualized as sort of large, powerful human beings, you cannot reduce God to any single element of his creation. In fact, the closest thing in some ways we can see God through are in fact his image bearers, which are us. We, the image bearers, are higher than anything we can take from creation and sort of make into it. And this, of course, is the source of the commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make a graven image of anything that is in heaven above or the earth below. Because you can't reduce God to a single thing within the world. When you try to make something from creation to represent God, you reduce God to one element of his creation. And Paul is basically reiterating the Hebrew prophets and their polemics against idol making. This is why you don't make idols, because in fact, the closest thing you have to image bearing is humanity, made in his image. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance. Now he commands all people everywhere to repent, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. Now, my friend Jacob, I actually preached on this text about 6 months ago, and in the rough draft, my friend Jacob basically said, in the past, God overlooked such ignorance, citation needed. And of course, Anselman jumped into the fray to respond to him. And this is one of the things I really enjoy about my friend Jacob. Many good Christians just sort of listen to the sermon and take it in. But no, Jacob's not going to just sit and listen. If he has a problem, he's going to tell me. And I love the challenge. It sharpens me. And so that's a good question that Jacob asks. And I think this comes basically from Jewish apocalyptic that developed with the prophets, because you have God as arena and God as agent. And in this tension, you see, well, has God judged the nations? Well, not completely. The nations are still going about their business making idols. And if God were to completely judge them, then God would destroy them. In other words, it's his forbearance that allows Athens to still stand. And you see this tension in Romans 1 through 3. God had clearly not brought his full judgment upon the nations. They're still standing. But God had brought a degree of judgment upon Israel. God had brought a degree of judgment upon many of the other nations. And I think Paul would have said the destruction of Egypt here, the destruction of Athens then, and these are all examples of God's judgment against them. And so I think the fact that they're still standing is, for Paul, an example of God's forbearance. Now, what goes further is that Jesus, in fact, is, he says, he has given proof to this to everyone by raising him from the dead, that this Jesus will be the judge to judge the world with justice. Now, often we sort of think of that in pictorial terms and think of Jesus on a throne handing out judgments, and I think that's a very valid way to think about it. Another way to think about it is to think about Jesus himself as the standard by which the world will be judged. Think about, well, I'm a pretty good person. Are you as good as Jesus? Because he's the standard by which you will be judged. I think that's part of Jesus as judge. Jesus is God's revelation of what humanity is supposed to be. Therefore, Jesus is the standard against which we are judged. And this is seen by Jesus overcoming death, because human beings are not made to die. And I think this is basically what Paul is saying. He is the standard. I got into this in my Romans class and in part 2 of Romans 2. And in fact, Jesus overcoming death demonstrates the validation of his righteousness and his power. Jesus is the judge of the world. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." And at that, Paul left the council. Now, I very much appreciate Luke's honesty here, because it's very believable that in a context like this, some people would scoff. People had already scoffed at him in the marketplace. Others were curious. This is a very strange teaching for the Greeks. But at the same time, this idea of vindication and trial would not have been unusual. People in the ancient world very much saw catastrophe as the judgment of God, and victory as the vindication of God. But all of these ideas that Paul is giving them, well, it's going to take a fair amount of time for people to sort of come around to it. And what Paul is really looking for, as many of us should be looking for, is the chance to have a conversation with someone who wants to have a further conversation. Paul is doing the work of making the God of Israel intelligible to the Greek world. And that's a very big thing, because it's a very big jump. There are points of contact available in philosophy that Paul could build on. It was a radical shift from human beings as self-interested spiritual agents, always looking to broker better deal with the Daimons, to becoming children of God. Children don't broker with their father. It's a radical transformation that Paul is proposing, and it's going to take some time. Now, most of us should have some understanding of a consumer spiritual culture, because in many ways, once Christianity is sort of pushed to the side, that's what people begin to default to. And it's tough for people to turn their backs on brokering. People like to feel that they are in charge, and they look for certain spiritual technologies to fulfill our desires and to pursue our goals. And we bristle at the idea that our world belongs to God. It isn't simply an impersonal marketplace for us to imagine that, well, maybe we can broker our way through it and get a better deal, or perhaps if we're savvy enough and can connect up with the right spirits, we can dominate. Now, Jesus demonstrates God's dominion in the strangest way for the Greeks. They expect some brutal power-over display of domination like Hercules or Achilles. But that's very much not the story of Jesus. Jesus dies on a Roman cross, and they would look at that and say, well, that's preposterous. No God worth his salt would be killed in such a humiliating way. They expect some obvious manifestation of physical excellence or conventional beauty. They expect some daimon that will take possession of them in some consumer brokered sense through an altar, a temple, an idol, or a spirit. But Jesus comes in a very different way. He clearly showed power. He clearly reasoned with those around him. But he submits to the Father on behalf of the weak and the lost for our well-being. His dominion is demonstrated both in the cross and in the empty tomb. The meek will inherit the earth because Jesus is both the most humble and the most powerful. And that's a combination that is radically new to the Greek mind. And it's going to take a while for them to get their minds around it. Well, we've been living with these ideas for quite a while. How do we live? Well, it's best that we not slip back into this spiritual consumerism, looking to broker deals with spiritual intermediaries. And it's not as intellectual consumers looking for the next big idea to ravish us like more carnal diamonds, but as children of God seeking his satisfaction within his world. This is the gospel. C.S. Lewis points out that, in fact, as we've been noting throughout this series, that, Well, it's a struggle until the end, until we see him face to face. The Christian doctrine of suffering explains, I believe, a very curious fact about the world we live in. The settled happiness and security which we all desire, God withholds from us by the very nature of the world. In other words, you're really not going to be able to broker your way to perpetual happiness and security by dealing with all of these spiritual powers that can overcome you. So God withholds from us by the very nature of the world, but joy, pleasure, and merriment, these things that in fact we can participate in, he scatters broadcast. People enjoy them. It's not bad to enjoy them. We are never safe, but we have plenty of fun and some ecstasy. It's not hard to see why. The security we crave would teach us to rest our hearts in this world and oppose an obstacle to our return to God. A few moments of happy love, a landscape, a symphony, a merry meeting with our friends, a bath, or a football match have no such tendency. All of those are fine things to enjoy in this world. Our Father refreshes us on the journey with some pleasant inns, but will not encourage us to mistake them for home.